And when you have it, I would that you would say amen. If you do not, simply look at the screens. Even though we speak in this way, beloved, we are confident of better things in your case, things that belong to salvation. For God is not unjust. He will not overlook your work and the love that you have showed for his sake in serving the saints as you still do. And we want each one of you to show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope to the very end, so that you may not become sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Amen. Friends, as a thesis verse for the message this morning, underline these words: for God is not unjust. He will not overlook your work and the love that you have showed for his sake in serving the saints. Brothers and sisters, with the help of your prayers and under the leadership of the Holy Spirit, we want to preach to you briefly this morning on the subject of, does God know I'm trying? Does God know I'm trying? Jesus was in a conversation once, and he was asked to distill down all of the teachings, all of the commandments, all of the rules, and all of the laws. Because if you go back to the Old Testament and you read Leviticus and you read Deuteronomy, you would say to yourself, this is a lot to keep straight. This is a lot to do and a lot to make sure that we follow specifically per God's instructions so that we do not run afoul of God's law. So to simplify things, Jesus said, look, let me make it easy for you. All I want you to do is love God and love your neighbor. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The challenging thing with the way that Jesus answered the question is that in the Christian church, the mistake that we've made is we have turned love into the highest thing you can do as a Christian. We've turned love into the hardest work of a Christian. And you really know you are walking with the Lord, and you really know you have advanced in your faith, and you really know that you have made it as a Christian when you're able to love God and love your neighbor. The problem is, the way that Jesus answered the question, Jesus was trying to tell us that loving your neighbor is not advanced Christianity. Loving your neighbor is actually Christianity 101. You see, brothers and sisters, we're not running for God when we love our neighbor, but actually, when you love your neighbor, you are just crawling. You are at the beginning of the faith. And if you really want to see what God can do in your life, you don't end with loving your neighbor. By the time you get there, you start with loving your neighbor. The best way that Paul explains this in the New Testament is he tells us that actually loving your neighbor is kind of like your ABCs. This is not advanced English when you learn your ABCs, but actually your ABCs are the very first thing that you learn. And once you get your ABCs down, once you know that you've got your ABCs, you can grow from your ABCs to advanced literature, where you can grow from your ABCs to poetry. You can grow from your ABCs to language and communication. But first, you've got to learn your ABCs. And then there's some great things that you can do with that. Well, brothers and sisters, the Bible is teaching us that loving your neighbor is one of the foundations for growth. If you want to be able to transform other people's lives, if you want to be able to speak life and healing into other people's lives, if you want to be able to be used by God to lift other people up the same way God lifted you up, then you grow to that point from the foundation of loving your neighbor. This morning, I want to honor many of you in here. Many of you are hungry for righteousness. And so you go to God and say, I'm hungry, so fill me up, Lord. I want to be the type who loves my neighbor. I want to be the type who shows understanding and reaching and securing. I want to be the person that you can use above all other people. And so I honor you for your faithfulness this morning. There are many in here who are trying to love your family members, trying to love your neighbors, trying to love your coworkers, trying to love people in your community. You're doing everything you can to love your neighbor, but isn't it struggle? Aren't you on the struggle bus when you try to love others and they don't love you back? When you try to give understanding for others and they don't reciprocate that understanding. When you try to reach and share to others but they don't want to reach and share back. When you try to show care and concern for others but they rebuke your care and concern. And many of us, the harder we try to love people and we don't have that love reciprocated, we just look up to heaven and we say, does God know I'm trying? Is God even aware of how much I am working to love this person? Is God even aware of how patient I've been with this person? Is God paying attention to how much kindness I've showed this person? Does God know what I could have said, what I could have done, how I could have behaved, and how I put all that on the back burner to try to show this person some love? And we get frustrated when it seems like God is on vacation. We get irritated when it seems like God is not paying attention. And so today I want to honor those of us who are trying to love your neighbor. And we want to answer the question, does God know I'm trying? In the text, there were many who had given up trying. They had simply fallen away from the faith. They saw the things that they were supposed to do. They heard the word that was being taught to them. And they just acknowledged this is too much. God is asking me to go too far. I just can't be out here forgiving other people. I just can't be out here being kind and loving my neighbor. I just can't be out here respecting everyone. No. I need those people to do that to me first. And then I'll do it for them. So love me first and I'll love you back. Show kindness to me first and I'll show kindness back. Respect me first and then I'll respect you back. And the Hebrews writer saw what was going on. He saw that we were developing a faith of reciprocity. I could only do the things of God for you if you first do the things of God for me. The Hebrews writer saw this in the synagogues. He saw this in the little house churches that were being developed. He saw this in relationships between married persons. He saw this in families. And so he decides he's not going to address those folks. If you've fallen away, go on, do it your way. If you don't want to follow God, the Hebrews writer said, I'm not dealing with you. But who I am going to deal with are the people who are still going to try. The people who are still going to love in spite of. The people who are still going to show kindness in spite of. And so he offers to those folks, the people who are in this sanctuary, who continue to fight to be all that God has called you to be, in spite of how you feel, in spite of how you've been treated, in spite of your circumstances, the people who are still fighting for the Lord. The Hebrews writer in the text offers you two things that ought to make you feel better, two things that ought to support you and what you are going with. The first comes in verse 9. We are confident of better things in your case. Your case is the case of people who have not fallen away. Your case is the case of people who still are walking with the Lord. Your case is the case of people who still are following God. And we are confident in your case that God is not unjust. Brothers and sisters, this is crucially important. You got to wake up and write this down. What happened to the Falcons in the Super Bowl, that was unjust. Chick-fil-A always taking away the peach milkshake once a year, that is unjust. Gas prices continually going up while the average wage is constantly going down, that is unjust. Higher sentences for crimes that people of certain color disproportionately commit, as opposed to other sentences, that is unjust. Parents being separated from their children at the border, that is unjust. These are things you experience in your life that are unjust, but the God you serve is not unjust. This idea of justice here, when the Bible talks about injustice and talks about God not being unjust, recognize this is not fair. There's a difference between justice and fairness. Just so you know, you never in your life want God to be fair. Because if God was fair, you would get what you deserve. And so thank God, God is not fair. Thank God, God has grace and mercy. Thank God, God reserves the right to give me exceedingly abundantly above all that I could ask or even imagine. I don't want God to be fair because I don't want God counting my sins. I don't want God remembering my mistakes. I don't want God judging me and bringing punishment on me for my wrongs and the things I do wrong. I don't want God to be fair. But I do need God to be just. And so when the text says that God is not unjust, it means that God has to be paying attention to what's going on. You see, in a legal sense, when we want justice, we all come before a judge, and you've got a prosecuting attorney, and you've got a defending attorney, and they all are sitting there, and they present all the evidence. They put everything out before the judge, and the judge must go through all the evidence. So they present all the evidence to the jury, and only after all the evidence is assessed, then is the decision made. When the Bible says that God is not unjust, it's the Bible's way of saying that God is aware of all the evidence. God has paid attention to every interaction that you've had. God is aware of every thought that you had that you didn't say and everything that you didn't want to do that you went ahead and did. God is aware of the evidence. God knows how hard you've worked to love your neighbor. God knows how you have shared and have given and have stretched. God knows what's going on. And you're saying to yourself, well, that's not enough for me. I know that God knows, but I want the preacher to know. I want my spouse to know. I need my children to know. I need some people on earth to be aware and point out to me and pat me on the back and tell me how good I've been. And here's the bad news, friends. If you wait for people on the church and people on earth to pat you on the back and tell you how good you've been, that's all the pat you ever gonna get. There has to be something on the inside of you that says, if no one ever notices how much effort I put in, if no one ever pays attention to how hard I'm working, if no one ever speaks to how much I'm loving my neighbor, I serve a God somewhere who's watching me and paying attention to me and sees me even if people aren't aware. And then you start to realize, I don't live in this life to hear your clap. I don't live in this life to get you to pat me on the back. I don't live in this life to hear you recognize me, but I'm living for my audience of one. This is why the songwriter said, over my head, there must be a God somewhere. Thank goodness my life is not limited by what other people can see. Thank goodness my life is not limited by what other people understand. Thank goodness my life is not limited by the finiteness of human beings. I'm so glad that over my head there is a God somewhere. God is not unjust. It would be wrong of God to create you and then ask you to do all these things and then not pay attention. It would be wrong of God to not hear your pain and know your every cry. It would be wrong of God to not interpret your moans and send his best angels down when you need them the most. It would be wrong of God not to pay attention. And so the Hebrews writer is trying to encourage the people of the faith, for the people who have not fallen away, for the people who have not made up their own faith, for the people who have not created their own righteousness. God is not unjust. Then if you keep on reading in the text and jump to the 10th verse, he says the following: for God is not unjust. He will not overlook your work and the love that you have showed for his sake, serving the saints as you still do. In other words, what the text is telling you is what God cannot do, what God is incapable of doing, what God shall not do, what God may not do, what it is not possible for God to do is to overlook you. God, you're the great sovereign of the universe. You are the great I am. You are the Alpha and the Omega. Of all the things that you've got to think about in a day, of all the things you've got to worry about in a night, of all the prayers that you are receiving, do you mean to tell me that little old me, you are paying attention to me? That you know the desires of my heart, that you are aware of the prayers of my mouth, that you know how hard I'm trying to love my neighbor and the kindness I'm trying to show, that you see me stretching beyond what I believe is possible so that I can do the impossible. God, do you mean to tell me that you are paying attention to me? The Hebrew writer says yes. God will not overlook
you. Did you know to not overlook somebody, you have to be looking at them in the first place? The good thing about the text is when you have not fallen away, when you have stayed true to this word that is in this book, when you continue to push yourself to be all that God has called you to be, when you are truly a soldier for the Lord that the Lord can count on, the Hebrews writer is letting you know that God is watching you. God, there's a whole lot of people in my church. How you going to watch all of us? Because most of them ain't paying attention to me no how. Most of them are not trying to follow my word anyhow. Most of them have fallen away. Most of them have never picked up my Bible. It's sitting just as pristine on their counter as the day that they put it there. But you, my child, who reads this book, you, my child, who prays every day, you, my child, who chooses to fast and stretch to be all that God has called you to be, you, my child, who hasn't turned your back on your child, you, my child, who deals with your crazy uncle and your crazy auntie, you, my child, who continues to be there for your family and your church and your friends and your co-workers, amidst all the people you are amongst. God is looking at you. I'm paying attention to you. I see the work that you're doing. I see the effort that you're putting in. I see how much time you are really trying to be my child. And the text says God will not overlook you for all the love that you have shown, for all the service that you have rendered. You will not go unnoticed. Your focus and your passion and your effort to stay the course. This, my brothers and sisters, is the crux of what faith is. Many of us are waiting to hear a well done from somebody on earth. We want somebody to notice how hard we've worked on our job, pat us on the back and give us a raise. We want our spouse to see how much humility we bring into the house to make the marriage work and pat us on the back and say, thank you. We want our child to notice how much we sacrificed over the years of their life and even after they left our house just so they could have a better life than we did. And we want that child to turn around and say, I recognize. Thank you. We are waiting for earthly applause. And the problem with waiting for earthly applause is somebody will eventually give it to you. And then you'll want some more. And then you'll get that and you'll want some more. And then you'll get that and you'll want some more. And you end up being a little hungry human, running wherever you gotta run to get some applause, continually fishing in the well of people's compliments just so you can feed the human's insatiable desire to hear a well done. There's a different way to live, the Hebrews writer is saying. There's a better way to live, the Bible is teaching us. You just gotta take God at his word. This is the crux of faith. This is what it means to have faith and to follow the Lord. I never get an applause from the human. I know that God is standing up for me. If I never hear well done from my child, I know that God is proud of me. If no one ever notices how hard I work on the job, I realize I didn't come here to work for them. I'm here because God gave me this position. And so I'm working for God to use these gifts that the Lord has given me. And God will say, well done, my good and faithful servant. Brothers and sisters, I want you to know that God does not overlook you because God cannot overlook you. So this is why you've got to continue to love your neighbor. Love becomes the harmonious sound that makes the angels in heaven sing. Love is the language of heaven that'll make Jesus stand up in your behalf. Love is how you and I show God that we are serious about the faith that we have been called to. And once you get to that point, then you can stand on the promise that is given in the 11th verse. That promise is this. And we want each one of you to show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope to the very end. I'm not doing this for no reason at all. There's a purpose. There is a plan. God knows what he is doing with me. God knows why you have the family that you have. God put it that way. This great designer put you at the job that you are at. So you have these co-workers for a reason. This wonderful master and creator had you join the church that you joined for a reason. God does not make mistakes. This great God that we serve puts you in the right place at the right time, dealing with the right people for such a purpose as whatever God's will is. And this is how you find God's will for your life. You don't turn away from loving your neighbor, you turn towards loving your neighbor. And the less love you receive from your neighbor, the more you love them back. And the less applause you receive from your supervisor, the harder you work. And the less people who are lifting you up, the more you reach to heaven. Because the harder I work to be all that God has called me to be, the harder I'm going to find God's will for my life. And when I find it, the 12th verse says, you will not become sluggish, but you will become imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promise. Friends, here's the bad news. You're not going to see it on earth. Here's the bad news. It's not going to come in a way that makes sense to our finite human minds. But here's the good news. If you take your faith and you add it to patience, waiting for that day, then the book says you will achieve the promise. So the question is simple. Does God know that I'm trying? The answer is even more simple. Yes, God does. God bless you, Providence.